So hello, everyone. Um, my name is Karen Steelman, and I am on the ARARA board. I actually serve now as the secretary. I also serve as the chair of the education committee, but I will say that I'm looking for someone to replace me in that. So if anyone is interested in the education committee, please get in touch with me. I would like to read our mission statement. ARARA, the American Rock Art Research Association, is a diverse community of members with wide-ranging interests who are dedicated to rock art preservation, research, and education in order to communicate to a broad audience the significance of rock art as a non-renewable resource of enduring cultural value and an important expression of our shared cultural heritage. So, what I love about ARARA is we have people from all different walks of life, and we all care about the study and preservation of rock art. So one thing you should know is if you are a member, you've probably gotten your email from Troy from the ARARA web sort of service telling you that it's time to renew your membership. If you're not a member and you would like to join our organization, if you just go to our website, Google American Rock Art Research Association, you can join on our website. These Zoom presentations are free and available to the public. They happen once a month, and we started these sort of once the pandemic started. And I think these are wonderful ways for us to communicate. Another announcement is that we offer student research awards. So if you know a student that is doing research on rock art, the deadline for these is January 31st, and you'll find announcements on our website. For a graduate student, a student pursuing their master's or their PhD, the award is for $2,500. And if there's an undergraduate student, there's also a new award for undergraduate students doing research on rock art, and that's for $1,000. So please spread the word and let students that you know about these awards. The last thing is we are going to be doing a virtual conference in 2021. It's going to happen on June 12th and the 13th. And there's a call for papers out, and that call for papers is due on April 1st. So if you're interested in that, all that information is on the website. So check that out. So today or tonight, we have Leigh Marymor giving a presentation on Western Message Petroglyphs, a faux Indian picture writing project in the American West. And this is really interesting talk. I'm looking forward to hearing this. I've seen Leigh speak about this once, and I didn't even know these things existed. So I am really excited to learn more. Leigh Marymor is the compiler of the Rock Art Studies, a bibliographic database, which is a searchable bibliography database of the world's rock art literature, and it contains more than 42,000 citations, which is just remarkable. And he is a past president of ARARA, and he's also a co-founder of the Bay Area Rock Art Research Association. I'm also supposed to tease him a little bit because he officially retired from his day job just I think this past week. So yay, I'm excited for you, Leigh. I know that you're going to spend a lot of time studying rock art and working on your bibliography database. And also I wanted to tease you because I saw you put a jacket on, so you have a coat. So thank you for dressing up for us tonight. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and let Leigh tell us about Western Message Petroglyphs.
Thank you, Karen. I don't think I've ever addressed ARARA without a sport coat, and I wasn't going to let tonight be the first time that I would lack one. So let me just see if I can do the technical bit here and get this slideshow up and running. That looks to be it. And somebody will have to tell me or Amy if there's any problems. Hopefully not. Yes. So, Amy, have you got me in your screen?
I have you, but I don't.
All right, so bear with me, folks. It's not like I haven't done this before. I have to go to share screen. That would do it. There we go.
Yes. No.
I'm going to do that. Amy. Let me find speaker view there, and hopefully that's it. Have you got me, Amy?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for that. I would like to thank the board of ARARA and all the ARARA members for the invitation to chat with you all tonight about Western Message Petroglyphs. This is an area of interest in mine since I was first shown the site in 1983 by archaeologist and Professor Al Alsasser at the University of California, Berkeley. And it was sort of a latent interest until the ARARA conference in 2014 when our mutual friend John Greer, archaeologist from Wyoming, challenged me to take this research on in a more serious way. And so here we are several years later, and on we go. I'm indebted to quite a few individuals for this work. This is not a project that I've done single-handedly by any means. And I want to thank my wife, Amy. I want to thank John and Mavis Greer, Jim Kaiser, the late Bill Sonnen, and the late Al Elsasser. Also, Judy Hilbish and Terry Carter, and so many others who have joined me on this journey over the years. And some of those continue on. Well, the term Western Message Petroglyph refers to a number of petroglyph sites that are recognized by their shared image content and layout. The imagery is drawn largely from a mashup of late historic Native American sign gesture language and picture writing traditions intermixed with pan-cultural imagery from all around the world. Now, tonight you're going to hear me refer to the Western Message author and use the pronoun he, but by no means do I want to imply that there only has to be one author and there only has to be one individual. In fact, we simply don't know, and in my own estimation, I visualize in my own mind that probably in this petroglyph project, there was one central actor with a small group organized around him, people who were in the know. Now, I'm going to try and touch on three major points, and I'll summarize them now so you know what to listen for. The first is I'm going to be discussing historic and geographic patterns observed in the Western Message site locations that allow us to infer earliest probable dates for the petroglyph sites. Beyond that, we're going to take a look at the imagery used in the engravings and show that it is demonstrably sourced from published ethnographic literature of its day, and that those dates reinforce the dates derived from the historic settings. And lastly, I'm going to I'm going to assert the definitions of the images that were published in that ethnography allow us to transliterate many of these panels and offer translations for at least some of them. Found scattered among 8 Western states, an increasing number of sites that fit the Western Message mold have been identified over the past 67 years, currently numbering 38 sites in all. And among those sites, we have 55 loci and 74 engraved panels. There's no question that these sites date to the post-European contact era based on images in some of the panels that depict Euro-American cultural content. We have, for example, depictions of a Western-style hat, a Western-style house, a rifle, a whiskey keg, the domestic horse, and so on. And we can also see the post-contact era is suggested by the smooth angular lines and chisel strikes produced by metal tools that we can see at virtually all of these sites. Let me go back here. Tonight, this presentation is going to focus on narrowing the time frame for these sites based on two additional streams of evidence. The first is that patterned associations with historic landscape settings tied to the era of Western expansion bind these sites together into a coherent whole and set a floor for their oldest probable dates. I'm going to use an example of 4 sites located in Utah and Arizona to illustrate the methodology that I used to connect these to the last quarter of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th. And secondly, a study of their imagery supports these proposed dates by revealing a smoking gun for the source of many of the individual images. The classic form of a Western message panel exhibits a central text suggesting picture writing. There are multiple icons arranged in either a single line or as many as 5 parallel lines, suggesting a text with semiotic rules. We can find orderliness, directionality, symmetry, repetition, inversion, compounded images, and even punctuation embedded in these texts. Often, let's see if I can get back to my pointer here. Often a lone image that I refer to as a signifier icon is set above, below, or to the side of the central text, suggesting perhaps a title, a header, a footer, very possibly personal signature in some instances. Variant forms of Western message panels lack the classic textual layout, but they share iconic Western message images with other Western message sites. Variations include panels that are limited to brief phrases, like the image of Tilden 1 in the Berkeley Hills, that combines these Hopi cloud images with Dakota Sioux calendrical devices representing 3 years. Variations can also include panels with as few as 1 lone image, like the lone esoteric form at Tilden 1, seen on the left, at Tilden 4, seen on the left side of the screen, also from the Berkeley Hills. Now, this image itself, despite being a pretty unique visual form, is common to the Western Message Petroglyph lexicon, and it's found at 9 Western Message Petroglyph sites. Unique esoteric forms become iconic when they're found to repeat over and over again at numerous sites. This somewhat amorphous skull shape sometimes appears alone or coupled with another signifier image in a standalone panel, as we have in this small panel from St. George, Utah. But it can also appear set above as a signifier or below a text in the classic panels. The point being that as few as 1 or 2 lone esoteric images can identify a site as Western Message Petroglyph as reliably as a complicated multi-line textual layout. The scattered, seemingly random distribution of the Western message sites begins to come into clearer focus as we focus on the geographic and historic contexts of each site and make note of the patterns that begin to resolve the 38 sites into a coherent whole. In the same way that prehistoric rock art sites can be defined by their landscape contexts, their public or private exposure, their view sheds, their patterning in relationship to landscape, patterns in relationship to water sources, overlooks, cultural boundaries, trails, and all the like, Western Message sites can be studied in relationship to historic landscapes. They are often found adjacent to, but somewhat remote from, and overlooking historic routes of travel, dating to the period of Western expansion during the last quarter of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th. Positioned at particular nodes along these travel corridors, the sites are very often situated in relationship to historic mining towns and rock quarries that boomed and busted during the same period. Many of these sites map neatly onto a Mormon cultural landscape, with approximately 40% of the sites overlooking Mormon towns and overlooking Mormon routes of travel. These are concentrated along the Mormon corridor, located along the western front of the Wasatch Mountains in Utah. And they overlook the Mormon Trail, California Mormon Trail, and a number of Mormon town sites. A predictive model for where additional sites might be discovered anticipated subsequently reported sites in Tombstone and Bisbee, Arizona, and at St. George, Utah. The model was based on a trifold criteria of proximity to historic routes, proximity to historic mines and quarries, and locations within the Mormon cultural region of that same era. Referencing back to that site distribution map and adding an overlay of historic trails, rails, and Western Message sites, it's easy to imagine fertile ground for future Western Message Petroglyph site discoveries along these routes. Across the West, the locations of Western Message Petroglyph sites cluster primarily in four regions: the far west, the Great Basin, the Southwest, and the Rocky Mountain region. The Google map shown here illustrates the vast area where the Western Message sites are found. I propose that the overlay of historic wagon roads and narrow gauge railroad corridors link these sites together into this coherent whole. Although we recognize that most, if not all, of these historic routes have deeper origins in Native American trails, I argue against assigning the Western Message petroglyphs to Native American origins. The immediate and patterned association with Western towns, mines, travel corridors, including the rail corridors, and the pan-cultural content of Western Message panels all argue against Native American authorship and point toward a faux Indian project at the hands of an educated Euro-American author. The St. George, Utah Western Message site is a textbook example of the patterned convergence of geographic and historic landscape contexts in association with historic Mormon places, quarries, and routes. This panel is engraved into a vertical sandstone face located at the base of the cap rock with long views overlooking the town below. The original town site of St. George was founded as a Mormon cotton farming mission in 1861 by the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, Brigham Young. Young selected St. George to be the location of the denomination's first Utah temple site. Construction was announced in 1871, with the temple dedication following in 1877. A Western Message site may be adjacent to, in line of sight of, or proximal, that is nearby to its associated historic features. All but 6 of the sites are found on elevated landforms with a view down and across the historic landscape. The others are in riparian locations and may represent camping spots adjacent to the historic features. Now, originally named Dixie St. George, the southwesternmost of the Utah Western Message sites, is located along the California Mormon Trail, whose route connected Salt Lake City with the church's distant settlement at San Bernardino, California. Like so many other Utah sites located along the Wasatch Front, the St. George site looks directly down at this historic trail, which today is roughly paralleled by the route of Interstate 15. So we have the Western Message site located here with a line of sight over the California Mormon Trail. The sightline also includes the location of the Mormon Temple. It's located here. And it's proximal to both the sandstone block quarry here and the basalt quarry, whose stones were used in the construction of the Mormon Temple. In the late, let's see, St. George, I want to mention, is also the terminus of the Mormon Wagon Road, later dubbed the Honeymoon Trail. Newlyweds living in remote Mormon settlements in Arizona territory traveled this network of arduous wagon roads to celebrate the sealing of their wedding vows with friends and family in ceremonies at the St. George Temple. In the late 1870s, one with difficulty could travel the Honeymoon Trail from the Western Message site at Tempe, Arizona, to the St. George Mormon Temple. And I'll just quickly summarize what I'm showing you here, that the Mormon cultural sphere, as I'm defining it, is roughly the boundaries of the state of the Mormon state of Deseret, which was declared in 1849, but disbanded in 1850. The map below shows the clustering of Mormon settlements, missions, town sites, and stakes circa 1890. And we can see that St. George is the southernmost site along that western Wasatch Front, which is the core for the Mormon cultural sphere of the day. And we can also see on my trail and rail map that the St. George site is pretty much central to the entire Western Message project. In order to magnify what I'm referring to when I speak about patterned relationships in historic landscapes, we can take a brief look at the Manta Utah site, where two Western Message panels are located up canyon and in direct line of sight with the oolite limestone quarry that was used to provide the building blocks for the second Utah Mormon Temple, which was built between 1877 and 1888. So if you will, I'm standing up canyon at actually one of two of the panels, this panel, looking down canyon with the oolite quarry in view, along with the Mormon Temple in the distance. And here we can see the relationship between those two sites. The Manti site is the one site in this corridor that's actually on the east face of the Wasatch rather than the west. The Manti sites affords a prime, so as a precursor to what's to come in this discussion, I want to make note that repetitions in the use of imagery can suggest shared authorship among the sites, and the Manti site provides a prime example of that. The repetition of 4 icons, albeit in juggled order, suggests shared authorship among the Manti and Berkeley 2, Tilden 2 Berkeley site. Each panel has its own unique signifier glyph, but the 4 central characters are the same, but simply given to us in a different order. The California Western Message Petroglyph sites all lack Mormon landscape connections, but the continuity of the imagery illustrates that the Berkeley author's connection to and possible roots in the Mormon corridor appear to be quite evident. At this stage of my research, I don't really have enough data to suggest which of these sites might be earliest and which may have come later. In this slide, we see a few examples of the Western Message author's adaptations to the published imagery. Excuse me. The Western Message symbol system is cobbled together into an original whole from a variety of late historic forms of Native American sign gesture, that's hand sign gesture, and picture writing traditions. 73% of which include pan-Native American images. Ojibwa KK1 tree bark drawings, Ojibwa Midewiwin Great Medicine Society song cycle notations, Dakota Sioux winter counts, Dakota Sioux agency roster picture signatures, Shoshone petroglyphs, depictions of American Indian sign gestures, and Navajo, Puebloan, Iroquois, and Algonquian imagery. Many of these tempered, no doubt, by the encroaching influence of Euro-American contact. Now, this picture becomes even more complicated as we take note that approximately 17% of the image content includes a bewildering variety of worldwide pan-cultural symbols, including Egyptian, Maya, Chinese, Hindu, Hittite, Irish, and possible fraternal order signs. Excuse me. The remaining 10% are from as yet unidentified sources, and some of these may be unique creations of the author. Here, details from the grave panel at St. George compare the time frame that the St. George landscape suggests with the time frame that the iconography suggests. In the St. George panel, we can identify elements copied from closely held Ojibwa Midewiwin Medicine Society songboards, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and Dakota winter counts. Culturally disparate, with some of these images not likely to be in circulation among the common folk in Native American or Euro-American communities. I propose that our Western Message author assembled his picture writing lexicon from the works of Garrick Mallory that he published between 1877 and 1893 for the Bureau of Ethnology, primarily of the Smithsonian Institute. Of those images not found in Mallory, that the Western Message author used, many of them can be found in earlier published ethnographies that in turn were referenced by Mallory. I find this to be a plausible explanation for the source of these images, rather than imagining a second Mallory-like individual with a similar facility with this far-ranging mashup of cultural imagery. Mallory's publications are our smoking gun. The St. George panel includes the Egyptian walking legs motif symbolizing locomotion, the Ojibwa Midewiwin slashed leg indicating magical transport or swift walking, and the Midewiwin symbol for hidden or obscure, and several signs taken from Dakota Sioux winter counts. Lone Dog's winter count was published by Mallory, was first published by Mallory in 1877, with additional winter count examples published in 1886 and 1893. This calendrical device, painted on a buffalo robe, was named for its chronicler and used picture writing signs to denote a key event for each calendar year. The events often reached back as far as the 18th century. The calendar keepers would use the winter count robes in recitals of these events to their bands. The events denoted by the images would best be recognized by the calendar keepers themselves and would be less accessible to others, but when they were known, they would be known largely in a much broader sense. In Tempe, Arizona, two classic Western Message petroglyph panels illustrate a second example where the geographic and historic context show a direct connection to the Mormon cultural sphere and routes of travel dating to the last quarter of the 19th century. The placement of two adjacent panels located on Hayden Butte are found in the riparian zone, set low on a vertical sandstone wall located along a dry wash that drains to the nearby Salt River. The riparian setting, although not unique among Western Message sites, is limited to a handful of examples that contrast with the lofty overlooks that the majority of the sites occupy. The historic routes of Tempe were established by Charles Trumbull Hayden, a merchant who moved into the Arizona territory following the ratification of the Gadsden Purchase in 1854. Setting up shop in Tubac and later Tucson, his stores served the local mining industry. In 1870, he purchased 2 sections of land at the north end of Hayden Butte for the purpose of establishing a mill, a general store, and a cable ferry across the Salt River. Beginning in 1877, it was Hayden who provided financial assistance and a welcome to the stream of Mormon settlers who were moving into the area to fulfill Brigham Young's vision for expanding Mormon settlements into Arizona territory. The original destination for these settlers was the tiny US outpost at Leigh, today Mesa, Arizona, which, as we know, is borders with Tempe. In 1882, Hayden was instrumental in advancing funds to one Benjamin Johnson. With his extended family of 7 wives and 45 children, Benjamin Johnson purchased town lots from Hayden to establish the first Mormon settlement at Tempe. Now, the history of railroad ventures throughout the West frequently intersects with the Western Message story. Over 2/3, that's 66% of the Western Message sites, are located adjacent to or overlooking historic narrow gauge railroad rights-of-way. The Western Message site at Hayden Butte exemplifies this pattern of association by proximity. In 1887, the Maricopa and Tempe Railroad Bridge was constructed across the Salt River at the foot of Hayden Butte. And in 1903, the Phoenix and Eastern Railroad tracks curved along the southern edge of the butte. Both rail lines pass within view from the 2 Western Message panels. As I begin to talk about Ash Fork, let me say I'm indebted to Stuart Lassiter Wild of Prescott for bringing the site to my attention in the early summer of this past year, 2020. The Ash Fork Western Message site is engraved at the base of a low-lying lava flow situated south of the town, bordering the floodplain of the Ash Fork Draw. The site is oriented toward the old town site and to the junction of 2 historic railroad rights-of-way. The old Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix right-of-way passes 300 feet distant in front of the Western Message panel. I'll just point out that I'm standing on a bluff on top of the panel and looking directly out at the Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix Railroad corridor. And in the far distance, traveling east to west, is the historic Atlantic and Pacific Railroad corridor, which today parallels Interstate 40, and the railroad is now known as the Santa Fe Rail. Following the completion of the Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix Railway in 1895, it became possible to make easy transit between Ash Fork and Phoenix, and continue on from Phoenix Station to Tempe via the transfer to the local Maricopa and Tempe Railroad. The latter rail, as noted, passed directly by the Western Message panels at Hayden Butte, suggesting that this travel corridor may have connected the 2 sites. The earliest likely dates for the Ash Fork Western Message Petroglyph site, based on this historic context, would be between 1882, the year that Ash Fork was established as a siding for the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, and 1895, the year of completion of the Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix Rail. In this table, I compare the founding dates of 3 Arizona townships with the completion dates of railroad rights-of-way that service them. In all cases, the Western Message sites are located adjacent to or in line of sight of the right-of-way. 2/3 of the sites share this pattern association with rail corridors. Rising to a level of significance, I infer that the township and railroad dates bracket a bottom for the earliest probable dates for the engravings. Tombstone and its Western Message site serve as a good example of how the overlapping variables of the town's history, railroad, and Western Message imagery suggest the probable earliest dates for the Western Message sites. And I would like to mention that the Tombstone site was first reported in 2016, June of 2016, by Michael Hargis. The Tombstone site sits atop a modest knoll that rises above the surrounding desert flat with a sweeping view of the Tombstone town site and mining district in the distance. The town and mining district boomed beginning in 1877 when prospector Ed Schieffelin discovered loose silver ore that had eroded out of the rich vein in the hills east of the would-be town. During the boom years, Tombstone was the most prolific mining district in Arizona Territory. The end began to unfold in late 1881 when the ever-deepening mine shafts struck groundwater, and one by one, the mining concerns began to flood. By 1893, silver production in Tombstone was completely abandoned. Of significance to the Western Message story was the advent in 1900 of a second silver boom made possible when Tombstone Consolidated Mines Company formed to take advantage of advances in steam pump technology that allowed for an economical method to drain the mine shafts. Silver extraction subsequently resumed at depths below the water table. Tombstone Consolidated bankrupted in 1911 following years of economic struggle with costly boiler and pump repairs, low ore values, and loss of production. The Tombstone Western Message site is accessed today from a narrow dirt road that winds its way out onto the desert flat from the edge of town. The track approaches the knoll with the Western Message site and nearly brushes its flank before continuing on past toward an old crossing over the San Pedro River. Eroding in places out of the roadbed, one today can see the remnants of the narrow gauge rails that were laid along this route in 1903 by the El Paso and Southwestern Railroad. To serve, this spur served the needs of the reawakened Tombstone mining district. This short spur line connected Tombstone with Fairbank, the junction point for the main El Paso and Southwestern line, which ran from Benson to Nogales on the Mexican border. The Tombstone Western Message site shares the now familiar intersection between mining, rails, and the Mormon cultural sphere. The Mormon settlement of St. David lies 20 miles northwest of Tombstone along the El Paso and Southwestern rail line. St. David was founded in 1877 by Philemon C. Merrill, a former member of the Mormon Battalion, and he, accompanied by a small group of settlers, originally intending to settle at Leigh Mesa, Arizona, found their way to St. David. The settlement began to thrive as a source of lumber harvested in the Huachuca Mountains and shipped by the El Paso and Southwestern Rail to serve the mines and growing town of Tombstone. I propose that the engraving event is more securely connected to the second silver boom of 1900 to 1911 based on its location adjacent to the narrow gauge rail right-of-way. During the early mining years of the 1870s to 1880s, the site location would have occupied a fairly random spot on the desert floor. Prior to the discovery of silver in 1877, the whole of the San Pedro Valley was a dangerous and lawless place dominated by Apache raiders and border-crossing desperados. The region was loosely protected by the Army outpost at Fort Huachuca. But indeed, when Ed Schieffelin first made his way into the area to begin prospecting, soldiers at the fort advised him that the only stone he was likely to find would be his own headstone. Schieffelin's first mining claim was aptly named Tombstone. Our author assembled the lion's share of his 150 element picture writing vocabulary between 1886 and 1893. We can't rule out that our author may have had some foreknowledge of sign gesture language and picture writing, but in any case, his broad command of these images would have been greatly enhanced by his encounter with the mid-century published ethnography, and especially Garrick Mallory's work. Constrained by the dates of the second silver boom between 1900 to 1911 and the rail right-of-way completed in 1903, I propose that the Western Message author would not have learned the symbol system prior to 1886 to 1893 and would not have engraved the panel at Tombstone prior to 1903 with the completion of the railroad spur from Fairbank to Tombstone that, as previously noted, runs within a stone's throw of the site. Using the same method to suggest the earliest probable date at Ash Fork, we compare the establishment of the town in 1892, as I've mentioned, as a siding for the Atlantic Pacific, and the completion of the Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix Junction in 1895. So I propose here that the author was capable of engraving this panel by 1893, but likely did not do so until 1895 or after, based on the site's location within, once again, a stone's throw of the adjacent rail right-of-way. The Ojibwa Metaweewin images are useful as timestamps for the Western Message panels in that this iconography was closely held within the medicine societies, requiring years of initiation and investment of personal wealth for membership. These picture writing symbols were not in common circulation among the wider Ojibwa community. There were other picture writing symbols, the Kekewin symbols, that did serve more mundane communication purposes that would have been accessible to Native American or Euro-American audiences, but not these. Not until Schoolcraft, 1851, and Hoffman, 1888, and again in 1891, published these images, and subsequently they were compiled and summarized by Garrick Mallory in the 10th annual report to the Bureau of American Ethnology in 1893. Do these images attain wide exposure? And then primarily to a literate audience with an interest in Native American anthropology and ethnography. I recognize that the Western Message author may have learned these symbols from Schoolcraft and Hoffman, but considering the Western Message Petroglyph lexicon as a whole, it seems more likely to me that they were encountered in Mallory's work in 1886 to 1893. In my study of the Western Message panels, I've identified numerous examples where the author literally lifted images directly from the Mallory text and placed them into Western Message panels that he engraved on the rock walls of the American West. His plagiarisms from Mallory and other ethnographies of his day make clear that his fluency with picture writing was for sure greatly enhanced by this encounter. I also can deduce, having located our smoking gun, that our author was well educated and was writing in pictures by choice rather than by necessity. In so doing, he displayed an intention to restrict access to the meaning embedded in his texts, the often remote access to the sites themselves, and the quasi-philosophic and numinous tenor found in the texts, in some of the texts, suggest that these writings may have been intended as private meditations. Authentic Native American picture writing is found in the rock art record, on cultural artifacts, or is documented in the ethnographic literature, simply does not exhibit the blend of multicultural imagery that we find employed in the Western Message panels. By combining pan-Native American picture writing signs, graphic depictions of Indian sign gestures, and world pan-cultural icons, the Western Message author created a faux Indian expression. Now, the description of an American Indian sign gesture used to represent the attribute of old man appears in a discussion of the way an unintelligible sign gesture became recognizable to Garrick Mallory. And he gives the following account of a sign gesture conversation with a Cheyenne Indian. So I'll quote. Mallory says, "A lesson was learned by the writer as to the abbreviation of signs and the possibility of discovering the original meaning of those most obscure. This from the attempts of the original meaning of those most obscure from the attempts of a Cheyenne to convey the idea of old man. He held his right hand forward and bent at the elbow. Fingers and thumb closed sideways. Now, this not conveying any sense, he found a long stick. Bent his back, supporting his frame in a tottering step by the stick held, as was before only imagined. There at once was decrepit age, dependent on a staff." Mallory, 1886. So, with Mallory's sign gesture image for old man in mind, it seems apparent based on our familiarity with the source material that the Western Message author co-opted Old Cloud's Dakota Sioux Agency roster signature with the Egyptian negation hieroglyph and placed the newly compounded symbols to serve as personal picture writing project. Let me point out, here we have the Virginia City Western Message panel and the icon for old man. But here, unlike Old Cloud's signature in Red Cloud's census at the Ogallala Dakota Agency, where old man is surmounted by a cloud to give the signature name of Old Cloud, here, old man is surmounted by this inverted antler motif, which in discussions in Mallory, he tells us he learned from Francois Champollion, the decipherer of the Rosetta Stone. He gives it as an Egyptian hieroglyph for the concept of negation, meaning no, not, never. So in this case, our Western Message author has compounded these two images to give us the concept of not old man. And in translation, I think we would read that as young man. Image appropriation from Mallory is apparent at the Vargas Plateau Western Message site in Fremont, California. Here we return to the Dakota Winter Count material first published by Mallory in the 4th annual BAE report in 1886. In fact, we return to the exact same page that we examined for the St. George panel. Here we see engraved on the rock and pictured in the text a curious inverted crown shape. We learn from Mallory that this is the winter count given by Boyaday, the flame, for the year 1815 to 1816, representing the Sand Sack's first attempt at building an earthen lodge. Now, the Western Message author may also have referenced the beaver pelt images that appear just a few pages later in the same BAE report. The beaver image is very similar to lone dog stylization representing Little Beaver, a French trader who was killed by a powder explosion in his trading house during the year 1809 to 1810. We can see that other Dakota timekeepers gave similar representations to their winter counts. This row represents images from the Flames winter count. And this row come from Lone Dog. And this row come from the Swan. So we can see that other Dakota timekeepers gave similar representations of an earthen lodge, but clearly our author has chosen the Flames image to place in his composition right here. Relying on ethnographically sourced definitions for these symbols, I've suggested transliteration of several of the Western Message compositions, and following that, I've attempted to extract plausible translations of them. According to Mallory, the method of reading late historic picture writing can be derived from the conventions pertaining to American Indian sign gesture language. In my efforts to read the Western Message petroglyph texts, I follow Mallory's observations on rules of grammar and syntax and apply these to the panels. I begin with a transliteration for each picture sign. Definitions are sourced from the 19th century ethnographers where we have them, and from 20th century interpreters to fill in the gaps. In some cases, we have no historic definition to turn to at all. And in these cases, we're confronted with white spaces in the text. And if that white space is too broad, we're at an impasse and then we're prevented from attempting a translation. Comparing a sign with unknown meaning in context of other panels where it appears allows us to test tentative translations for it. In some cases, poetic license allows us to arrive at an approximation, but in all cases, our best translations can be no better than our attempt to recover the author's intent, tempered by our own preconceptions. I proceed with the assumption that the Western Message author is attempting to communicate a message, and I'm attempting to receive it by grounding myself as best I can in what's known about this historic era of American Indian sign gesture language and picture writing. So if I can walk you through this, here we have the falling leaf moon representing October, beaver, earthen lodge, river, above, village, obscure or perhaps hidden. Depiction of a travois, meaning perhaps travel or travail. A quartered circle, 4 directions everywhere. Above, nothing. Beaver, great, a great many. And death, illness. Moving from the transliteration to the translation, we have falling leaf moon, which is October. Falling leaf moon, beaver lodge upriver from our village. We don't understand. All around upriver, nothing. A great many beaver have died. If you follow me, falling leaf moon, beaver lodge, upriver from our village. We don't understand. It's hidden. It's obscure. We don't understand. Travel, searching all around, upriver. Nothing. A great many beaver have died. Well, I've shown you several Western Message panels, and we've recognized images that are repeated among sites. These repetitions establish shared authorship when unique images or combination of images appear at multiple sites. The pinwheel motif occurs only at 4 sites, and all of these in the southwest region. The image may have been sourced from Brasseur de Bourbourg in a publication referenced by Mallory and interpreted by Bourbourg to mean crater or volcano, a theme to be of plausible interest to our Western Message author, perhaps used as a synonym for mine, which is also a hole in the ground. The map illustrates the location of the primary railroad corridors serving the Southwest in Arizona and New Mexico, with the Western Message petroglyph locations as nodes along those routes, and the repetition of the pinwheel motif along those routes. I infer from these observations that our author is the same at each of these sites. His route of travel can be approximated along these rail lines, and his activity can be bracketed by the published dates of the images he's using and the places he's choosing to engrave the panels. And allow me to point out the Flagstaff site with a yellow center means it has a pinwheel. 50 miles due west, Ash Fork, down along the Santa Fe, Prescott, and Pacific Rail to Tempe, another site with a pinwheel, down along the Southwestern and Pacific Rail with its spur over to Tombstone, another pinwheel. Couple ways to do this, but if we remained on the Southwestern and Pacific, we could take a spur up to Bisbee where there's another site, or if we're on the Southern Pacific line, we can stop at Lordsburg where we have yet another site, and we can take a branch line connection from Deming on up to Silver City on the Deming and Pacific Rail to the Western Message site there where we have yet another pinwheel. Co-occurring images at these sites expand the web of connections over many more sites. Eventually, the overlapping images demonstrate shared authorship for all 38 sites. Now, it's noteworthy that this symbol system is not an alphabet and the individual images do not spell out words. Each image performs the duty of an ideograph, and within the context of the overall text may function as a noun, a verb, an adjective. Images can embed layers of meaning from the most representational, apparent interpretation to any number of synonyms within the bounds of the textual context as a whole. For example, a symbol for snow might also be read to mean winter or cold. An individual image can embed much broader concepts as well, in the same way that the Red Cross, the Christian cross, or the Iron Cross function in modern Western society to reference a multitude of culturally recognizable ideas. Taken together, the whole of the text carries a messaging intent, one that can be approximated, as we'll see, but that would be difficult to verify without access to the author's contextual reference. Here at Locus 3 at Austin, Nevada, we have deer, go, come, hunt, mountain, a westerly direction, broken leg, pause, it's a comma, travois again, travel, travail, pause, death, illness, sickness, injury, great, life, go, come. In translation, deer hunting in the mountains west of here, a broken leg, such travail, such a great many injuries attend this life. Deer hunting in the mountains west of here, a broken leg, such travail, a great many injuries attend this life. Or how about this from Del Norte, Colorado? Man, go, come, great many, life, I say, man, not, walk swiftly, pause, one night, chief, conflict, confrontation. Huh, okay. The man who travels a great distance in life, I say, is the man who is not walking swiftly. Chief one night's contention. The man who travels a great distance in life, I say, is the man not walking swiftly. Chief one night's contention. You'll notice I've not attempted to translate the footers because honestly, I have no idea at this point. And what about from Mission Pass near Fremont, California, Alameda 51? Wise man Wise man, illness, walk great, go come distance, pause, walking, spirit, house, dead man, illness, death, pause, go come distance, not great, conflict, confront, illness, death, I say. Once again, huh. The wise man says, disease can travel a great distance. Walking to church, an infirm man died. I say the journey can be greatly shortened when one is confronted with illness. The wise man says, disease can travel a great distance. Walking to church, an infirm man died. I say the journey can be greatly shortened when one is confronted with illness. And finally, I suppose here at Tonopah, Nevada, we have an I, E-Y-E, I. And look, here again, we have a not old man. We have a young man. Walk swiftly. You did so. You cross over. Dead man. Spirit above. Completion below. You killed man. Pause. Friendship, river fight, great, dead man, disabled man, good fortune. What to make of that, huh? Oops. The young man transcended quickly. You did so, you did so. The dead man crossed over to the spirit above. You were not finished below, killed man. The big fight parted a friendship. One dead, one disabled. Fate. Well, I'd like to begin to wrap this up with an appreciation to Bob Mark, who in August 2020 gets the discovery credit for the 38th Western Message Petroglyph site located at Flagstaff, Arizona. A variant Western Message site composed of two elements, the now famous pinwheel and the equally famous and iconic weeping eye, surrounded by the Western Message author's convention of surmounting a letter M above. If you look carefully at Bob's 3D image of the site, you can see the very faint handprint behind the engraved image here and here, easier to see in my reconstruction using D-Stretch and some other digital tools. We see actually that this is another iconic convention at probably a third of the Western Message sites where a painted handprint was impressed upon the rock and an esoteric image was engraved in the palm. This site from a lofty height also overlooks the Atlantic Pacific Railroad corridor. And with that, sort of by invitation, I will end with a quick commercial for the Rock Art Studies Bibliographic Database. Oh, quick, take a screenshot. Here's the web address right across here. And I would like to share that this project is hosted by the Museum of Northern Arizona and co-hosted by the Bay Area Rock Art Research Association. And should you take advantage of this research tool and land yourself on this website, you will find a link that will take you to a bibliographic data search form. You can also avail yourself of a PDF tutorial, which will give you some very simple instructions on how to take best advantage of navigating the data form, and also a guide to keywords, which has literally hundreds of place name and thematic keywords that will help you with your searching, whether you have your own keywords in mind or you're looking for some synonyms that might gain you some other publications. When you land on the search form, it will look something like this. Oh, wait a minute, there's that website again, right there. Screenshot, write it down. You will find that the search form, confusingly, is populated by data, but all you need to do is click on the finding tool, and you'll be presented with a blank form where you can type in your own search terms, as I did, to return this one record for Garrick Mallory. I typed Mallory here, I typed 1877 here, and there I got reminded for the citation to a calendar of the Dakota Nation in the Bulletin of the United States Geological and Geographical Survey of the Territories. Very helpful in putting this talk together tonight. I found this one of 43,311 citations included in this database at the moment. If I get multiple returns to my query, I can sort them using a tool here by any of these fields, but most usefully by author and date. And I can also go to this little icon over here, and that will present me with a number of ways that I can view the data in a couple of different formats. I used that tool, just as an example, to refresh my memory on all of Garrick Mallory's publications on Native American sign gesture language and picture writing conventions. Very helpful to me putting this together tonight. I also was able to query the citations for all of these different publications that Mallory references in his text. And here we quickly have them listed for you here, but you don't need to remember these because you can go to the database and query them for yourself. And I also queried those people, those authors who have used over time Mallory as a primary source for their projects or their publications, including, of course, the Western Message Petroglyph author, but also a famous hoax coming out of Cottonwood Canyon in Utah, a series of articles about finds in a copper mine, tablets, ceramic and copper tablets, and the like, that were full of very intriguing, what were purported to be Native American imagery, until I went thumbing through Mallory and plucked several of those images right out of Mallory and matched them identically with what was on the artifacts. But also any number of authors who have referred to Mallory to construct their own publications on late historic Native American picture writing. With that, wow, I'd like to thank you for your patience with my rambling on and on in this topic that so has captured my interest and passion and attention. And I hope you have enjoyed the ride. There we go. How do I get?
You have to do a stop. You have to do a stop share.
There we go. Hooray. Okay.
Well, thank you, Leigh.
Wow, thanks, everybody.
Okay, so I presume by now everybody's got their copy of Mallory and they're trying to decode this. So please use the chat and let's see if we can, help Leigh out with his encoding and decoding here. So let's see what questions we've got. We've got a few already. So yeah, if you have actually paged through this, you realize that if someone's going to try to decode stuff, they're not probably going to be using this book. It would take them forever to decode something. Question is, do you think that somewhere in some dusty archive or trunk, there's a piece of paper that provides a key to these symbols?
Wouldn't that be great? And I really hope so. I've been looking for it for about 6 years now. And I've gone down so many rabbit holes, but come up with nothing. But one of these days, let's hope.
Yeah, can you remind us how many different symbols you found?
Well, if you count up each individual symbol across the 74 panels, there are actually about 755 engraved images. And of those, approximately 150 images are unique. So you can see that images repeat time and time again across sites. But about the lexicon is about 150 images.
Okay, and have you ever put together a histogram of the images so you see how many of each one there are?
Well, I have an offer from a database techie who's offered to help me do exactly that, and
Yeah.
it sounds like a retirement project.
I mean, doing a histogram wouldn't be too hard. You just have to name each one, and then it'd be pretty quick to put that together and just.
I do have them in a spreadsheet all named, and Judy Hilbish, who's an avid Western Message petroglyph researcher, who has a book published called Stone Diary, has her own tables that do exactly that. But they're not in a histogram; they're just in tabular form.
Yeah, because I'm a computational linguist, so I'm thinking of how to statistically analyze this, and I would look at the distribution by geography and distribution by type. That's where I'd probably start.
Sounds like you and I could squeeze a paper out of this, Peter.
Yeah, we might want to do that sometime. Okay, so let's see what other questions we've got here. Let's see. Okay. So how close would these sites need to be to trails, rails, mines, quarries, and Mormon places for you to consider them close? Close.
Yeah. So there's the macrocosm and the microcosm, right? So we took some macro views at St. George, and we saw where the Western Message site was situated within the town of St. George, and where was it situated within the Mormon corridor and the Mormon cultural sphere, and the vast network of other Western Message sites. So that provides some landscape context on a macro level. But quite frankly, most sites are in direct line of sight, most frequently like the St. George site that I showed you, or the Virginia City site that we looked at that I interpreted for you is a good example. That site, I think the mountain that Virginia City backs up against, if I recall, is called, I want to say Wheeler Mountain, but that might be wrong. But Virginia City, Nevada backs right up into this mountain, literally 1,500 feet up on the top of the mountain, out a long, narrow ridge, kind of a spine. And from that ridge, 1,500 feet up, you're looking right down on the city of Virginia City and right down on the mining district. And right there is the Western Message petroglyph panel. So that would be a good example of how this works. It doesn't necessarily need to be close, although the Truckee Hand site up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, you pretty much could walk 50 paces and kick the railroad tracks of the Transcontinental Railroad if you wanted to. There are 4 loci there. So it varies, but they're proximal, they're within line of sight. Sometimes you can reach out and touch the landscape.
Yeah, you always wonder if there's some kind of mine claims or something, right? People are leaving behind. Yeah, because you wonder, were they intended for somebody else to decode? Do you think?
Well, Peter, here's the thing about that. If so there's so many connections with the rails, and the history of tramping and hobos along those same railroad lines where the Western Message sites co-occur in time, in the sense that beginning in about the 1870s, right after 1869, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, thousands of soldiers released from the Civil War began moving west out along the rails, tramping and hoboing along the rails. those guys were all staying down pretty much in the rail corridor, and that's where you find their monikers, their signatures, usually their names, and sometimes an arrow showing directionality, and sometimes some kind of a logo connected with the name. The Western Message guy, he's not down in the rail corridor leaving his mark. He's up on the high ground above looking down on those folks, and his sites are often very difficult to find. They tend to be in private locations rather than publicly announced locations. Down in the rail corridor, a tramp is leaving his name with an arrow for others to come along and see it and relate to it. Up on top of the mountain outside of Virginia City, on this narrow little ridge, no, that's a private location, and I don't really think that anybody's intended to see that unless by invitation. And I can tell you by personal experience, even then, knowing where the sites are, they're often hard to find and hard to get to. So no, I think this is a private expression or meant for a very small group of people in the know to participate in.
Right, because they'd have to even know to get to it in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah, so following up on that, there was a question whether you suspected that the author might have been a railroad employee or contractor.
Well, I certainly think that the author shares a connection to the railroading of the day, of the last quarter of the 19th century. Now, whether that person worked for the railroads, as a surveyor or an engineer, or whether that person was just taking advantage of the railroads to get from place to place, I really don't know. The same can be said with the mining interests. At least a third of these sites are directly looked down on mining concerns at mining towns. So was the author connected to the mining industry? Narrow-gauge rail and mines co-occur as well. You got a mine, ultimately you're going to have a narrow gauge railroad that came to serve it, to haul the ore away. So it's a level of detail that until we get that that journal that someone was asking about, it's going to be hard to know.
Yeah, I mean, given the Mormon interest in the Indians, you wonder if it's somehow tied in with the Mormon origin stories or whatever of the 12 tribes of Israel or something, that they would put this stuff up so that they could maybe show other people of their faith, hey, look, this is where some early people had traveled.
There certainly are such stories that circulate in Mormon country that ascribe a Mormon interpretation to the panels. I just don't find that those really address the totality of the 38 sites as a whole and the commonalities that they share across the Western landscape and the nature of the icons.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the original Joseph Smith or whatever, right? He supposedly discovered some Copper Indian writing with some scrolls, right? So it kind of fit with that.
There's a site at Fillmore, Utah, where the panel was interpreted to mark the location of the lost golden tablets, and there was a Mormon fellow came up from Mexico and translated that particular panel, which basically he translated as dig here, which meant boring a mining tunnel into the side of this sandstone massif. And ultimately, two of his miners literally lost their lives in that mine after blasting away in a morning and coming back in the afternoon to re-enter the mine shaft, and were overcome by carbon dioxide poisoning.
Yeah, wow.
The stories are spin-off tangentially from Western Messages. You can find yourself talking about all sorts of things.
Yeah, so a couple of people asked, you tended to read the messages left to right. Do you feel justified in doing it? What's your justification in doing that? Just because that's the way English is written?
Well, I mean, that would be one justification. Others have made an argument that they should be read right to left. Hoffman, in his publication on the Midewiwin symbols, says that they were read from left to right. And I also find that those parallel vertical lines which indicate a pause or a rest, which are basically the grammar notations, commas and periods. They tend to accumulate on the right side of the texts. Not always, but they tend to accumulate there, suggesting that you would read from left to right until you come to a stop and then continue on the next line and continue reading. So keep in mind, these, I've been discussing my observations and my research and my theories about what it is we're looking at. But there will be, many other proposals, and have been, about what this all means. And they might not sound anything like what I'm proposing.
Yeah, I have to try stuff and see if they make sense in different contexts. Another question was, let's see, had you found any more figures of the leg with the magic line drawn across the middle, signifying distance, accomplished through supernatural powers? Did that show up in more than one place?
Well, yeah, that shows up in quite a few Western message sites. It's a common, I don't have the count in front of me, but we could collect the count. But yeah, it's a common Western message icon.
Okay, so distance might be something in there, yeah. Okay, a lot of people want to know who the authors are. Let's see. Okay, someone says, I thought there was a quarry near the Lordsburg site. Was that more recent, or would that have been relevant?
So the Lordsburg site is one of those that is, I actually showed a picture of it, but it's on the top of a kind of a freestanding hill or knoll, and it looks directly down on the old wagon road that goes out to the historic Shakespeare mine, just south of the I-10 corridor, just south of Lordsburg.
Yeah, so here's a question about its motivation. What good is a language like this unless some group of others can read it? Or maybe they were just done to create a puzzle rather like these recent monoliths that have been showing up.
Well, for me, somebody's asking who was the author. I don't know who the author was, but I begin to intuit some forensic, characteristics of who this person may have been. To me, if the person's Mormon, they don't represent the mainstream of Mormon theology, but a counter reaction to it, perhaps. I see eccentricity. I see somebody who is trying to create difficulty to access the meaning in their texts by intention. Why is that? Well, I think you find that perhaps in various religions, Mormonism may be one amongst them, but also in fraternal associations where you have to gain a certain level of initiation before you're in the know and can understand what the symbol system means. And I intuit some of that going on here as well.
Yeah, are there Mormon settlements near each of these?
Well, as I said, about 40% have what I would call a direct association to either a Mormon route or settlement, or in one case, in the case of Tombstone, in a Mormon line of commerce over the southwestern and a railroad line.
Yeah. So yeah, based on that histogram you put up of those different relationships, there wasn't anything that kind of covered all of these.
No, and I've done Venn diagrams, and the vast majority share, if the variables are travel corridors, mines and quarries, and a Mormon connection, and those are the three main variables, then the vast majority of the sites intersect with at least two of those, and quite a few of the sites intersect with all three, but certainly not all sites intersecting with all of them all the time.
Yeah, so getting back to that question of is this one person or a small group of people, would you looking at the geographical distribution, how many people do you think would have been involved to have created all of those sites?
Well, I would say definitely as many as two and probably as many as a few. There are sites, the Flagstaff site is a good example. I showed it where we have a pair of handprints impressed on the wall. This happens not only at Flagstaff, but the Truckee site up in the Sierra Nevada have actually 4 pairs of handprints. And the Dunsmuir site in Northern California has 2 or 3 pairs of handprints. The Tilden site in Berkeley has 1 pair of handprints. And the prints are not the same. Sometimes there's a large print and a small print, almost like a man and a woman's, or a man and a younger man or child. Sometimes the thumbs on the handprints are straight, like mine, and sometimes the thumbs are the bent, recurved thumbprint, which represents a recessive gene. So fewer people have the bent thumb than the straight thumb. That implies to me that more than one individual is involved. But how many more? I guess it's too soon to say.
Yeah. Can you make any? Can you distinguish different ways of doing the carving, like different tools at different sites?
There are some sites that look cruder than others. There's one site at Bircham Creek on the I-395 corridor in Eastern California, where the figures are larger than the norm. So there's some variation in execution, which might suggest a different individual. And well, yeah, and certainly Amy's talking to me off on the side that a lot of these sites have been revisited since they were originally engraved, and they've been enhanced. So when was that done? Was that done shortly thereafter, or quite a few years after, or a mix of cases? We don't know.
Yeah, so here's a good question. What kinds of artifacts, if any, are turning up in the soil at the base of these sites?
Well, the best example I have for that is at the Tilden 1 site in the Berkeley Hills, which is on a very steep chaparral rich incline. I mean, Amy and I go out to visit that site, and we'll spend an hour and a half going a couple hundred yards because the chaparral is so thick and the terrain is so steep. But at the base of one of one of 6 engraved boulders on that hillside, we found old bottle glass that an archaeologist, Jeff Fentress, estimated had to have been pre-1906 when the glass manufacturer changed. So that's a good example. I think John and Mavis might have noticed other things that don't come to mind, but there you have it.
Yeah, boy, well, you got a good mystery there. I think we've covered all the questions in chat. Just cycling through them one more time to make sure. Okay, so we should finish up pretty soon, but I guess there are a couple of more. Let's see. How long might it take a dozen people to create one of these panels in hard rock versus sandstone?
Gosh, I really don't know. My assumption is that each panel is created by one person during one engraving session. That's because the character of the panels all pretty much each one seems to hang together as a cohesive whole, as opposed to suggesting an accumulation of symbols by multiple people over time. And I guess it really does depend on the rock, because we've got panels in granite and we've got panels in sandstone. So, but the quality of the engraving is pretty good all in all. So I would think that a talented engraver who knew his way around some rock carving tools and a hammer could knock them out pretty efficiently.
Okay, and are the handprints, when they show up, are those real life size?
They are impressions of real live hands, and most of the handprints just appear as just very ghostly, faded prints, if that. And we're highly indebted to John Harmon and D-Stretch for being able to recover the locations of some of these hands that we just simply, we're unable to see. We know that they were painted on the rock surfaces at one time because we have contemporary oral histories from people who have seen them back in, say, as late as the 1940s and 50s. And we have some newspaper accounts that have photographs of them. I'd say the earliest photograph I've seen of a Western Message handprint would be the Fillmore print from about 1935. It was photographed.
Yes, you may be able to use the finger lengths and all relative finger lengths to see if they're male or female. It was a suggestion somebody made.
Well, interestingly enough, these handprints don't persist in the way that prehistoric indigenous prints do, that were done with hematite and binders that bled and stained into the rock. These all seem to have been surface pigments that weathered fairly quickly in a 30-40 year time span. So that's another way of gauging the fairly young time range for these, that we're not really looking back much further than, say, the 1880s, maybe the 1870s.
Yeah, well, okay, you've given us lots of stuff to mull over. Hopefully people will go home, or I guess everyone's at home, will be thinking about this, and maybe they'll have some suggestions for you the next time they see you. So I'd like to say thanks once again to Leigh Marymor for the presentation. Thanks to all the attendees for your interest. If you would like to learn more about what ARARA does, remember to check out our website, Facebook pages. And our next talk on February 13 will be Jeffrey Lefebvre on rock art in Colombia. So until then, good evening and stay safe.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Leigh.